I really like because it's a little bit like a roadmap. It kind of shows us where we're going with different things, and it also puts some anatomical structures on each of these, but not too many because we don't want it to be overwhelming. So when we take that first job of the nervous system, which is sensory input, we see right here that we have sense organs that are responsible for gathering information. Right? Now, when we talk about sense organs, we talk about things like, or we think about things, I think, like the eye, and the ear, and taste buds, and things like that. Here we're using that term a little bit more loosely to basically anything that detects information about our internal or our external environment. That information, though, travels down what we call sensory or afferent pathways to the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. And it's that brain and the spinal cord, the central nervous system, that acts as the integrating center for the body. Right? So this is where integration occurs. This is where integration occurs. Okay? Anything that we don't need to act on is essentially kind of ends right here. But if we do need to act on that stimulus, then we have these outgoing efferent motor pathways in which we have outgoing information, right? So these motor pathways have that action that we need to do in response to that stimulus. Now, our motor pathways are divided into a couple of different divisions. We have what we call somatic motor pathways, which lead to skeletal muscles. And then we have autonomic motor pathways that go to our internal organs and glands. So a little bit of a division right there, but we're still okay. So this diagram just sort of reiterates what we were just talking about in the previous slide. But let's go ahead and kind of put some things on this. So in 50A, you guys talked about the brain and the spinal cord in quite a bit of detail, right? Towards the end of the semester, you looked at the brain and the spinal cord. So you looked at the different parts of the brain and what they do. You looked at the spinal cord and so on and so forth. And we also, in 50A, talked about skeletal muscles, right? So as far as our motor pathways go, right now we kind of understand skeletal muscles. Don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz or anything like that if you've forgotten a couple of things. But you did learn how motor neurons travel from the central nervous system to a skeletal muscle. They release acetylcholine onto the skeletal muscle. That sets off the signaling cascade where you have actin and myosin eventually binding to each other, and you have the shortening of the sarcomere. Right? So we learned about that in 50A. Okay? So a lot of this diagram we kind of already know, or at least have a pretty good idea about. So what do we have to learn about? Well, in here, in this class, we're going to learn about the peripheral nervous system. Okay? In fact, today, we're going to talk about the anatomy of nerves, and we're also going to start talking about cranial nerves today. Okay? So in our first unit, we're going to tackle the whole idea of nerves and stuff like that as it relates to the peripheral nervous system. We're also, in our first unit, going to talk about sense organs. Right? We're going to talk about them kind of generally, but then we're going to take a closer look at the eye and the ear. Unfortunately, with the time that we have in this class, we don't have time to go into all of our sense organs. But the eye and the ear are good little packages that we can look at in a relatively short period of time. And so in this first unit, we're going to tackle some of this. And then in our second unit, in unit 2, we're going to hit our very last part, which is the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so we're going to talk about our autonomic motor pathways. We'll talk about sympathetic pathways, parasympathetic pathways, and how they work together to regulate our internal organs. So by the end of Unit 2, we should have pretty much everything on this roadmap sort of marked off. We should have visited every place on our map right here. You guys have already visited some of the places, but we're going to kind of keep chipping away at it until we get to just about everything. So hopefully, by the end of Unit 2, you guys have a really good, picture of what we're doing. Does that make sense? I like maps, so I like to draw it out. I like to draw things out like this and start to kind of look at how everything sort of fits together. It's a really helpful way to sort of do that for me anyway. Just a couple of quick reminders. Your central nervous system is made up of your brain and your spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is made up of your nerves, your cranial nerves, your spinal nerves, and all of the peripheral nerves that sort of arise from those. Those peripheral nerves are the ones that we kind of already know the names of, right? Like the big one in our leg is called the sciatic nerve. You probably have heard of that. Your funny bone is one called your ulnar nerve, and stuff like that. So we're going to take a look at some of those in the next couple of weeks. So again, you guys have already done a lot of this stuff. We're just going to very briefly review it today. The right-hand side of the screen. Okay, more review, just really quickly. I'm going to try to go through this quickly, but not too quickly, so as not to bore anybody. Despite the fact that the nervous system has some really important jobs, and honestly it's really, really complicated, the anatomy of it is relatively simple when you look at the cells that make up the nervous system. So in the central nervous system, we have 4 types of what we call supporting cells. In the central nervous system, we kind of collectively call the supporting cells neuroglia. Sometimes we get a little bit lazy and we just call them glial cells, so sometimes you'll hear them referred to as that. Again, I know you guys had a lot of this in 50A. I'm just kind of giving a very brief review of some of this. So astrocytes are probably the most prevalent neuroglial cell. They're responsible for much of what we call the blood-brain barrier, which sort of separates the blood from the neurons in the brain, helping them stay safe from potential pathogens and toxins and things like that in the blood. They're very, very prevalent in the central nervous system. Microglia are sort of the housekeepers of the cell, or of the CNS. What they do is they kind of float around in fluids and between other cells, and they clean up, for lack of a better term, just debris, junk. All the time, cells are kicking out worn out organelles, different things that just aren't really usable anymore. Cells are kicking those out. There are some cells that will die and have to be replaced by mitosis. Those dead cellular fragments have to be cleaned up. So these microglial cells are just phagocytic cells that work to kind of clean things up. We learned in 50A about the movement of cerebrospinal fluid through our central nervous system. That cerebrospinal fluid is circulated by ependymal cells. And then, of course, we have oligodendrocytes, which form the myelin sheaths in the cerebrospinal. There's a couple of visual aids to sort of help you with those. And then in the peripheral nervous system, we only have 2 supporting cells. We have Schwann cells, which form the myelin sheaths. We're going to spend some time today looking at Schwann cells. And then we have satellite cells as well that surround the cell bodies and form cushions around those cell bodies. We never really focus on satellite cells, but if you look right here, they sort of surround the cell body and just kind of form a cushion around it. It's usually the Schwann cells that we focus on that form the myelin sheath around these different axons. So, with all of that said, what we focus on primarily in 50A, as well as in 50A, focus on these are the cells that do the real heavy lifting in the nervous system. They're the cells that are responsible for receiving messages as well as transmitting messages. So they're really, really important cells. And they outnumber all of the other cells by a pretty large margin. What we have here is we have kind of a typical neuron, the way that most textbooks draw it. You guys will remember that all neurons have a most of what you're used to finding in cells, right? We have a nucleus in there. You're going to find a lot of mitochondria. You're going to find Golgi apparatus. All of the things that you would expect to find inside of a cell are going to be in that cell body or the soma. One thing that it does have, and that we see here, is we see that these neurons, these cell bodies, have a lot of this missile substance. Can you remember what organelle is missile substance? It's rough ER, yeah, it's rough endoplasmic reticulum, right? Missile substance is rough ER. Neurons make a lot of proteins. They're releasing neurotransmitters, which a lot of times are either proteins or they have a very high protein content to them. So because they do produce as much protein as they do, we have to have a way to make that. And that rough endoplasmic reticulum that's there, it just stains really darkly in neurons when we look at it under the microscope. And because of that, they give it a special name called missile substance. It's really just rough. Neurons are characterized, all neurons are characterized because they have these projections that come off of the cell body. All right? So if we look at the projections on this particular neuron, we see that most of them are these really short little guys. They're really numerous. And then there's a singular long projection coming off of the other side of the cell. These neurons that are coming off of this side of the cell, of which there are many of them, those are called dendrites. And then you have that singular long axon that comes off of the other side of the cell. That ends in these axon terminals that we see right down here. Okay. I erased some of my marks really quickly. The little arrows on this diagram will show the direction of information flow. So we see that the arrows on the dendrites are all leading towards the cell body, and then the arrows on the axon are leading away from the cell body. So the dendrites are what are receiving information from other sources, and then the axon is what's transmitting that information to whatever the next thing in line is. So in the case of skeletal muscle, for instance, like you guys learned about in 50A, there would be a skeletal muscle right down here that would be receiving that information from these axon terminals. This is probably a fairly simple neuron. Some of the neurons in our brain have been estimated to have as many as 100 million dendrites. So this one has like 7. But imagine one with 1 million dendrites connected to other cells. Some of these pathways in our brain are extremely complicated and quite frankly, way outside of my realm of expertise, and definitely outside the realm of this class. But suffice it to say, these dendrites, like the one we just looked at, and like the one that we see here, these are called multipolar neurons because they have the cell body, and they just have multiple projections coming off of that cell body. Again, the dendrites receive the information, the axon transmits it, so the information travels in this direction from left to right. Okay. The one that we see down below that, it's called a bipolar neuron. It's called a bipolar neuron because you have a single cell body, and then you have 2 projections coming off of the cell body. Right? That prefix bi meaning 2. So we have the dendrite and then the single axon. Again, information flows from left to right, starting with the dendrite being transmitted by the axon. Bipolar neurons are really, really rare. They're not common in our body at all. The only place we really have them is in our retinas, in our eyes. In fact, in a couple of days, when we take a look at our retinas under the microscope, we'll see those bipolar neurons in a layer of our retina. It's pretty cool. And then finally, our third and final kind of structural type of neuron are the one that we see down here at the very bottom. This is called a unipolar neuron because there's that single short process coming off of the cell body that's attached to the dendrites and the very long axon. main types of neurons. Multipolar, we have bipolar, we have unipolar. The multipolar and the unipolar are what we primarily focus on in most of our discussions in this class. And again, those bipolar neurons are really rare, only found in one place. Okay, again, I think it's kind of helpful to sort of map things out. So this is a diagram that I like to help us to kind of put things in context and understand structure and function. I know that you guys have the central nervous system in 58, and I promise not to quiz you guys too hard on it, but we do need to remember that it's there. So what I'm going to do is I am going to circle the spinal cord here, okay? So I just circled the spinal cord. If something is inside of the circle that I just drew, it's part of the central nervous system. If something is outside of the circle that I just drew, it's part of the peripheral nervous system, okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at what we have here. So looking at this, you see that this blue neuron right here has these dendrites that are exposed, right? Those are the ones that are sort of facing whatever is over here, right? So remember, the dendrites gather information, okay? So when information is being transmitted by this, it starts out here, and it goes this way towards the central nervous system. This is a sensory neuron. It has that information going to the the central nervous system via what we call sensory pathways, okay? One down here on the bottom, the dendrites are all here in the central nervous system. Information starts there, and it goes in this direction towards muscles and glands. This is a motor, right? So what we can see, if I erase some of my marks, what we can see is that sensory information comes this way to the central nervous system. We have our integration happening here, whatever that looks like. We'll talk about that briefly in just a second. And then we have the outgoing motor information in this direction. So we see that we have that loop of information, very similar to that flow chart that we started the day with. Integration is something that I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about because we kind of covered it in 50A. But remember that the spinal cord sends a lot of its information up to the brain. Okay, so the brain is doing a lot of the integration. Motor information is coming down the spinal cord as well. So there's a lot of kind of up and down communication happening right here. There is some integration that happens in the spinal cord, but it's fairly limited. Most of it's sent to the brain, and then the motor information is. Okay. But still, we can use this diagram to sort of portray a loop, and I kind of like it in that regard. Let's see here. A couple of other things. Let's take a look at the structural type of neuron that we have right here. And let's start with our sensory neuron, the one that we have here in blue. This is a pretty stylized diagram, right? The nuclei of these neurons look like little googly eyes, which I think is adorable. But nevertheless, we have this guy right here. This is our cell body. So based on that and the projections that you see coming off of the cell body, tell me, is this a unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar? How many projections are coming off of the cell body? One. So that's a unipolar neuron, right? So this sensory neuron is a unipolar neuron. And you'll also notice that the cell body is outside of the central nervous system. The axon does end in the central nervous system, but the cell body is from outside of it. The other guy that we have right here, this guy, there's a dendrite, there's a dendrite, there's a dendrite, there's your axon right there. Is it unipolar, bipolar, multipolar? Multipolar, right? Multiple projections coming off of it. Again, I know it's pretty stylized, but those little pointy things are your dendrites. into that single axon. So this is a multipolar neuron. This also happens to be a multipolar neuron here as well. So again, we have multipolar neurons here, and we notice that this cell body is inside of the central nervous system. And the motor neuron cell bodies are in the central nervous system. Okay. Any questions so far? And disorder review-ish? So coming back to you? Good. It's coming back to me too. All right. Like I said, I really like the diagram that I have on the board right now, because I think that even though it is kind of like a little cartoon with the neurons, it shows very clearly how things kind of are working. But we have to remember that in the real world, right, it isn't just one neuron coming in here, right? There's a whole bunch of sensory neurons, right? There's also a whole bunch of motor neurons, right? So even though the diagram is only showing one, we have to remember there's a bunch, right? A good example of that would be like this model that I have right here. Let me switch over really fast. Just kind of show you this, right? So this is kind of the same idea that we have in this model is on the diagram, where you've got your sensory neurons. You've got your sensory neurons coming in right here. You have your motor neurons coming in here. But look at how many there are, right? Not just one, a whole bunch of them in the front of it, right? So what we have to do is we have to talk about a little bit of vocabulary about when we have clusters of neurons, because it's never just one, right? There's always many. So we might have some neurons, some neuronal cell bodies, kind of like these. Those long axons and axon terminals, kind of like this. Right. Right, so something like this, right? We've got lots of neurons. We have all of the cell bodies up here, and then we have all of those axons kind of down there like that. So we have that cluster or bundle of cell bodies up here like this, and we sort of have this bundle of axons right down here like this. Kind of like holding a bouquet of flowers, right? If you're holding a bouquet of flowers, you're holding all of those stems together. That would be like the axons right here. And then coming out of the top are all the flowers, right? Those are all the cell bodies, right? So we can kind of think about it like that as well. So what do we call this? Right? You guys remember we talked? I know I talked about it. That's okay. So we have different terms for these things depending on whether we're in the CNS or whether we're in the PNS, peripheral nervous system. So in the central nervous system, that cluster of cell bodies is called a nucleus. It's called a nucleus, the central nervous system. I feel like we use that term a lot in anatomy, don't we? Right? We talk about the nucleus of an atom, where you find the protons and the neutrons. We talk about the nucleus of a cell, where you find your DNA. And now all of a sudden we've got a nucleus here referring to a group of cell bodies. But there are some really important nuclei in the brain, these clusters of cell bodies. If we have time when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we'll talk about a couple of them. Because there's a nucleus in your brain, for instance, that governs your sense of hunger. There's another one that tells you when you're full. There's another one that makes you sleepy, and so on and so forth. So we'll talk about those a little bit later on. In the peripheral nervous system, though, we call that same cluster of cell bodies, we call it a ganglion. Okay, we call it a ganglion. In the central nervous system, that group or bundle of axons is called a tract. You guys might remember learning tracts in the spinal cord. And then in the peripheral nervous system, that bundle of axons is called a nerve. So that's obviously where we're going with this, is we're going to start talking a little bit about nerves. So a little bit of different terminology, depending on what part of this nervous system we're looking at. CNS versus PNS. So if we come over to our model, over to our model really quickly. Again, we see those nerve fibers from our sensory neurons kind of coming in right here to the dorsal side of our spinal cord, specifically to that structure that we call the dorsal horn. And then leaving on the ventral side of the spinal cord, you have those motor fibers. But if you look, you notice, you come out just a little farther, and you'll notice that those sensory fibers and those motor fibers all get bundled together right here. And when we bundle those axons together, we get a nerve. So this is what we call a spinal nerve. This is what we call a spinal nerve. We're actually going to look at our spinal nerves, where they go, in a lot of detail really soon. But this is a spinal nerve right here. And those axons are bundled together. You'll also notice this little enlarged area right here. It's labeled number 24. But this is where you would find those cell bodies of those sensory neurons. PowerPoint really quickly. And you look, you see those cell bodies right here. That's what we call a ganglion. Okay? This particular ganglion has a name, has a specific name. Do you guys remember what it is? It's one of my favorite things. Dorsal root ganglion, right? That was the dorsal root ganglion, okay? Because it's in the dorsal root of the spinal cord, which is the structure right here. So it's called the dorsal root ganglion. Oh, how about that? Some fall for some of yours. Okay. Okay, so we have that ganglion right there. We have other ganglia that we're going to be paying attention to, primarily in Unit 2, but this isn't the only one, but it's one of them. But those ganglia are clusters of cell bodies. Okay, so does that make sense a little bit about where nerves come from? A little bit? Okay, cool. Let's take a look at your but I do want to kind of move on, and I want to start to talk about nerves in a little bit more detail, which is kind of the second part of this lab. And what we'll do here in just a minute is we'll get out some microscopes and we'll look at some nerves under the microscope and stuff like that. But again, nerves are, by definition, going to be a bundle or a cluster of axons that are in the peripheral nervous system. So you can see axons bundled together on the little drawing right here. And here we see in a little bit more detail what that bundle actually looks like. So the nerve is shown here. It's coming up out of the bottom of the screen. And it is a bundle of axons, but the bundles are sort of grouped together into smaller groups inside of a layer of connective tissue. So the entire nerve is wrapped in a layer of connective tissue called the epinerve. You can see that right here, sort of being peeled away. That prefix epi means above, so the epineurium is this layer of connective tissue above everything else. And then the axons, like I said, are grouped into smaller bundles inside of the nerve. So we see here that those smaller bundles are called fascicles. So for instance, if we look inside of the nerve, we see a fascicle of axons right here. We see a fascicle of axons here. We see another one here. And we see another one right here. And those fascicles are wrapped in a second layer of connective tissue tissue. Again, we see it being pulled away right here. That's called the perineum. Have we seen this structure before? Yeah, we sure have. Where have we seen it before? So skeletal muscles, right? Skeletal muscle fibers are glued together in an almost identical way, right? They're grouped together inside of a muscle, but inside of the muscle we have fascicles, and then we have the individual muscle fibers, right? I think it's really neat that evolution has converged on this structure more than one time. There must be something to it. I don't know what the explanation for it is, but I think it's really interesting. The other thing to kind of point out about that is sort of a word of caution, I guess. I don't know what exactly to say. But you'll notice, for instance, that the connective tissue that we find here covering the nerve is called the epineurium, but the connective tissue covering the muscle is called what? It's called the epimysium or the epimysium, right? The connective tissue covering the fascicle of muscle fibers is called the paramysium, right? So what we're seeing is, well, on one hand, two similar structures, right? And I think that makes learning this a little bit easier because you guys have already seen the structure before, right? So it's easier to visualize, it's easier to sort of remember. The flip side of that is that it also kind of creates multiple words that sound really similar to each other, right? But mean very different things. So epineurium and epimysium sound really similar to each other, right? Perineurium and paramysium sound really similar to each other, right? So what we have to do is we have to start being careful as our vocabulary grows. We have to start making sure that we're actually calling things what they actually are. Brain farts do happen, right? They happen to all of us. I probably am going to call this the paramysium by the end of the day today, accidentally. So brain farts do happen, but I'm almost certain I'm going to get a lab exam back from somebody where you're calling this the epimysium, for instance, right? Like I said, it happens, but we don't want that to happen on tests. So just be really mindful of the words that you're using for things, because it does matter, and it does change the meaning. Even just a couple of letters can really drastically change the meaning of the word. So a little bit of a word, just to kind of make sure that you're paying attention to vocabulary. Now that our vocabulary is going to be growing considerably in the second semester. Anyway, moving on, then within the fascicle, you have your individual myelinated axons that are wrapped in a third and final layer of connective tissue called the endo. Right? So we have these three layers of connective tissue. So it's really kind of neat that we have this, and like I said, the fact that we've seen this structure once before, I think is really, really helpful. We also, you'll notice, have really cares about where I stand apparently. We also have blood vessels in our nerve. They're bundled in with our nerve. Probably this is because they probably are just going the same place that the nerve is going, so they're being bundled in with it. And I also suspect that there's probably just the fact that we have to deliver blood to the nerve itself. Axons take a huge amount of energy, and as a result of that, there needs to be a nutrient and oxygen supply really close by. Those blood vessels that are packaged with the nerve, like you see right here, they're called the vasa nervorum. They're called the vasa nervorum, which is Latin, literally, for nerve vessel, is what that's Latin for. So that's what we see right here, the vasa nervorum, those blood vessels. So it's a fairly simple structure. It's definitely one that we've seen before, which is refreshing. When we look at a cross-section of a nerve under the microscope, it looks like you would expect it to look based on the drawing that I just showed you. So this particular nerve is coming out of the screen at us, right? It's going like this. This is the long way of the nerve coming out of the screen at you. And we're looking at it in cross-section right here. And one of the things that I think is immediately apparent, to me anyway, is the fascicles, right? We see that the nerve itself is divided into a whole bunch of smaller groups. It's divided into a whole bunch of smaller groups. So we have a fascicle here, we have a fascicle here, we have one here, 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 here. Many fascicles within the nerve itself. And you can also see on here, and they're labeled, you can see the layer of connective tissue surrounding the nerve itself. That would be your epineurium, kind of right through here. And then you would have your perineurium that you see here between the fascicles right there. Okay, so even on a low power view such as this, you can see some of the really important features of the nerve. So, with that said, why don't we get our own slides of the nerve out and take a look at them. Nerves, by definition, are all part of the peripheral nervous system, but they have to come from or be connected to in some way to the central nervous system, because we have to communicate with that integrating side. So, for instance, here, just to kind of come back to this diagram or this model from a little bit ago, here we have our spinal cord, of course, and we have those sensory fibers in our dorsal root right here, and we have those motor fibers in that ventral root, and when they're bundled together, they create that structure that we call a spinal nerve. Now, we're not going to look today, at least, in any more detail at our spinal nerves than this. We have kind of a whole lab devoted to our spinal nerves and where they go. But suffice it to say that they are named in very similar ways to the ways that we named your vertebrae in 50A. Remember, they're divided into regions, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and then they're numbered. The identification of these guys is pretty straightforward. But they do go kind of some wacky places, so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few days. So our spinal cord is one of the places where our nerves arise from, or where they intersect with our central nervous system. And these spinal nerves are something we're going to look at in more detail in a few days. But the other ones are our cranial nerves. These are the ones that arise in the brain itself. And that's what we want to spend some time with today, kind of starting to introduce these cranial nerves, the ones that arise on the brain itself. Which is why those brain models are out on your guys' benches so that we can use those today. Just really quickly, a little bit of an additional introduction to nerves is our spinal nerve, as you can see right here, is a combination of the nerve fibers from both the dorsal root and the ventral root. Because it has both sensory fibers and motor fibers in it, we say that our spinal nerves are all what we call mixed in function, meaning that they have both sensory and motor fibers in it. Okay? An individual neuron can only do one thing, right? It has its job and it only does that job. So a neuron can only be sensory, or it can only be motor. But a nerve, being a bundle of neurons or a bundle of axons, can have both sensory and motor fibers in it. And when it is, we call it a mixed nerve, meaning that it has both sensory and motor fibers in it. So our mixed nerves have both sensory and motor neurons bundled together. Some of the nerves that we're going to see, especially in our cranial nerves, have only sensory fibers in them. So we say that they're sensory nerves. And some of them have only motor fibers in them. So we say that they're motor nerves. Okay? We see a little bit of variation. When it comes to our spinal nerves, they all are mixed in function. But our cranial nerves can be one of the three. Okay, mixed sensory or motor. Most nerves in our body are mixed, but there are some that, like I said, are very specialized in terms of function. So, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about cranial nerves. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that arise at the base of your brain. And 4 of those, I'm going to steal this one from you guys. It's a newer one. 4 of these, we need to know a couple of things. So we'll grab a brain model really quickly. And we put up our diagram of our nerves. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at essentially the inferior surface of the brain, the base of the brain. And this is a diagram that I found just by searching for cranial nerves on Google. And I really like it because it's color-coded in a way that makes a lot of sense. One word of caution, though, is that if you do pull this off of Google for your own studying, the labels are wrong. I had to correct these before I could show it to you guys. So I like the color coding. Whoever made this is a very good graphic artist, and they did a great job of color coding the nerves. Unfortunately, they just didn't quite make them correctly. So just a word of caution there. You can see where I had to put a label over one that was already there. I think this one was labeled incorrectly as well. So there was a little bit of a goof there. But for the most part, it's a good color-coded guide to your cranial nerves. So you'll notice that each of the cranial nerves we'll talk about the identification of them in just a second, but each of the cranial nerves has a name and a number associated with it, right? So for instance, the first one that we see right here, the one that's the most anterior, this one right here, is the olfactory nerve, and it's also cranial nerve 1, okay? The next one behind it is the optic nerve. The optic nerve is right here. That's cranial nerve 2. And then we go from there to number 3, the oculomotor nerve, number 4, the trochlear nerve, and so on and so forth all the way back. We'll get to the names of them just here in a minute. As far as your identification of these goes, okay, you're going to need to know the name, you're going to need to know the number, and you're going to need to know the function. As far as the function goes, there's 3 options. They're mixed, sensory, or motor. Okay, and I'll show you how to learn those here in just a second. Okay. Keep in mind that when you write the numbers of these cranial nerves, that they need to be written as Roman numerals. You'll see how all of these are written down as Roman numerals. For whatever reason, I don't know the answer to it. The convention is to write Roman numerals for the numbers of cranial nerves. For most other things that we do in this class, we can use normal Arabic numbers that we're used to, but we use Roman numerals for the cranial nerves. So I have those kind of on my next slide over here as well. Again, I'll kind of come back to this in just a moment. But I included a table on the next slide of this, which is in Canvas. I included a table to kind of help you with some of this. So the numbers of our cranial nerves are right here. Again, numbered 1 through 12. I guess learning Roman numerals now gets us ready for the Super Bowl in February, right? Bad joke. It's my first day for that one too. It was one I just came up with. Maybe it's better of a spring semester joke. But you know, they always do the Super Bowl in Roman numerals, and nobody really knows what the heck it means. Yeah. Right. I'll try. I'll work on it. I'll work on it for spring semester. I think I can make it better. But I do have the Roman numerals 1 through 12 listed right here, and then I have the names of them right next to it. This might seem like a lot on the first day. It is kind of a little bit confusing sometimes, depending on how we go about it. One of the things that can help these things be a little bit easier is if we use memory devices to help us to remember some of these things. We call these memory devices mnemonics. So, for instance, one of the memory devices we can use is to take the first letter of the names of those cranial nerves and come up with a saying that includes those first letters that's a little bit easier for us to remember, right? Remembering olfactory, optic, ocular, motor, trochlear, trigeminal, adjacent, spatial, vestibular, cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal is really hard. But remembering, on they traveled and found Voldemort guarding very ancient Horcruxes is a little bit easier, right? So if we can remember that saying, it makes it easier to remember the first letter of the names of our cranial nerves, right? It's obviously not perfect. You have multiple O's that you have to deal with right off the bat, but at least it kind of gets you in the right order, which can be a little bit helpful. The good news is that this is not the only memory device for the names of our cranial nerves. There are many of them. If you want to write your own, you may write your own. That's something that you can do. If there's a little saying that you'll remember easier, you can do that. You can also go to Google and Google cranial nerve memory device, and you're going to find like 100 of these things, right? Fair warning, most of them are dirty. I guess we remember the dirty jokes better than the clean jokes, right? But most of them are kind of dirty. But I guess if it sticks in your mind, it sticks in your mind. This one was family friendly, so it's the one that I chose to put into the PowerPoint. But nevertheless, find something that works for you, find something that's easy to remember, and you can kind of go from there. I also, on this slide, have the function of each of our cranial nerves listed as well. So for instance, cranial nerve number 1 is a sensory nerve, number 2 is a sensory nerve, so on and so forth. There's a memory device for that as well. This one is like super easy. It's some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. If you remember that, you'll see here that the S in some corresponds to the S in sensory, and so on and so forth. So if you can remember the little saying here, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more, boom, there's the function of your cranial nerves. Okay, pretty easy. So on an exam, I might point at one of these cranial nerves, which we'll talk about here in just a second, and I might say, give me the name, number, and function of this structure. Okay, name, olfactory through hypoglossal, number, Roman numerals, and function, sensory, motor, release. Okay. As we go on in the next couple of days, we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at some of these cranial nerves, and I might ask you some additional questions about those cranial nerves. You're going to be very clear about what those are. But if I say name, number, function, the function is only sensory, motor, release. Okay. And again, you'll see which ones we're going to expand on as we start to go through this in the next couple of days. But this table, I think, is a really, really good start. Let's come back over here to our actual nerves themselves. Let's take a look at one of our brains, and let's go through these things. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I am going to switch over to my brain. So the good thing about these is, for the most part, they do go in order. The hard part, I think, is just practicing with the different brain models that we have in the room so that you can kind of confidently identify these on just about any model. And with a little bit of practice, you'll be able to do it with relatively few problems. Today, we're going to go ahead and start on the brains. And I do have a couple of additional models that I'll get out on Friday for us to continue to practice with. Okay? I just didn't want to overwhelm you guys today. So if we start with a brain model and we start to look at it like this, we will see that it kind of corresponds to what I was just projecting on the PowerPoint slide. So this guy right here, this is going to be cranial nerve number 1. This is going to be the olfactory nerve. We go back just one step, start working our way backwards. We run into cranial nerve number 2, which is the optic nerve. Cranial nerve 3 kind of hides from us a little bit. If we're looking at it like this, we want to say that it's this thing right here, but that's the mammillary body. The cranial nerve 3, the ocular motor, kind of hides up on top of the pons. So if we turn our brain see it hiding right there. That's going to be cranial nerve number 3 right there. So it's not as visible like you can see from right here. You can see it just barely sticking out right there. That's going to be cranial nerve number 3. This guy right there is cranial nerve number 4 is the trochlear nerve. It's this guy right here. Most of our models show it being very skinny, long, and spindly, which actually makes for a really good landmark for us to be able to use. So we have cranial nerve number 4. And then right behind number 4 is number 5. This is what we call the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve is really, really big. And when you cut it off, there's just a big footprint that's left by it. So it tends to also be a really good landmark. Okay? The trigeminal nerve gets its name because it does have 3 branches or 3 bodies that are associated with it. And if we go back to our diagram that I had projected, you can actually see this is your trigeminal nerve right here, and then it has 1, 2, 3 bodies. I do have some models that show those 3 branches of the trigeminal nerve. I'm not going to worry about them today. We'll get them on. Okay. But I do have some models that show those. But that's how the trigeminal gets its name. Is it has 3 primary branches. But we can see just the base of it kind of right here. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So we're just counting our way back. And then what we have to do is we go from 5 down to 6, which is the abducens right here. Okay. Has kind of a funny name. Sometimes we just call it the abducens instead of the abducens nerve. I don't know why we do that. I guess it's from California. You guys got that joke, right? Because we call highways the whatever, right? No? All right. Come on. Yes, I appreciate the laugh on that one. But it's called the abducens, or just the abducens. That's what we have right there. So you'll notice here what we're doing is we're working our way back, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I am continuing back, but I'm also going kind of medially right here to number 6. And then I have number 7, which is the facial nerve, which is right here. Right next to it is nerve number 8, which is the vestibulocochlear. Okay? So 6, 7, 8. 9 and 10 are also really close to each other. Cranial nerve number 9 is this one right here. This is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then number 10 is quite possibly one of our most important cranial nerves. This is the vagus nerve that we see right here. And then if we come all the way down here to where the spinal cord essentially starts, you have cranial nerve 11. This is called the accessory nerve or the spinal accessory nerve. And then what we have to do is we have to come back up to the hypoglossal nerve, which is number 12. Okay. There's a lot there. Okay, so number 1 is the olfactory nerve. Okay. Going straight back, we have the optic nerve. We have number 3, the oculomotor nerve. Number 4, we have the trochlear nerve. Number 5, the trigeminal. Number 6, we have the abducens. Number 7, we have the facial. Number 8, we have the vestibulocochlear nerve. And in about a week, you'll see why it's named the vestibulocochlear nerve. Number 9, we have the glossopharyngeal nerve. Number 10, we have the vagus. Number 11, we have the accessory. And then number 10, we have the hypoglossal. So we have several nerves here. The biggest thing is just getting the counting down, right? Getting confident to go from the front to the back and be able to find those. Okay. Once you feel confident in this, okay, once you have done this, you feel confident, you've talked about it with each other, turn turn your brain around and go the other direction, right? Start with number 12, go to 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, so on and so forth, all the way back to the front, right? Do it backwards. And then take your brain apart and do it with only a half of your brain. But practice, practice, practice until you're comfortable. Like I said, I do have a couple of additional models that show these, but I'll wait till Friday to pull them out. I want us to get confident with them between now and then before we finish. But practice with these. I'll come around and I'll help you guys. But let's just get comfortable naming these nerves, learning the name, number, and function, and then we'll start to worry about some of the other details associated with the nerves. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and turn this back.
That's okay. I'm like, wait.
All the way back up. So let's practice our cranial nerves for a little while, and then we'll kind of go from there.